The idea was that you must go to the white man, it was the statement, to get everything you need. He controls everything, and if you fight him, he's going to fight back, and he's going to hurt you, and he's going to win.
Had we been your friends for years?
Yes, sir. Sure.
Had we worked more of them than anybody in this country?
Yes, sir. Sure have.
Right.
In a strange, almost perverse way, it was the institution of segregation that gave black people the strength and the solidarity they needed to fight for equality.
Segregation meant not only the hardships, and it meant not only the terrible anxiety, but it was also a sharing time. It was also a sense of community and a sense of collective accomplishment in the face of just terrible odds.
What if the place you live, the very foundation of your life, was determined not by your hard work or your dreams, but by the color of your skin? What if, no matter how much you strived, the doors to decent housing were closed to you? Locked bylaws, policies, and a history of racism that shaped every brick and mortar of your reality? Imagine being told, generation after generation, that you weren't welcome in the homes, neighborhoods, or communities that could have lifted you. This is the painful story of racial segregation and concentrated poverty in Black America, a history that still echoes through the walls of today's cities. Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. To understand the roots of housing segregation in Black America, we need to rewind to a time when Black people were enslaved, before the first bricks of modern cities were even laid. During slavery, Black people were considered property, not citizens. They were forced to live in makeshift quarters on the plantations where they worked, often with little more than a small shack or a poorly built hut to call home. These structures were crude, often made from whatever materials could be scavenged, like wood, mud, or even old scraps of fabric. There was no privacy, no comfort, just the harsh, suffocating reality of being forced to serve their enslavers. Former slaves were forced to find work under new terms, often as sharecroppers. This system didn't offer real ownership or improvement. Sharecropping meant that Black families rented land to farm, but they had to give a large portion of their crops to the landowners in exchange for using the land. This often left them with very little to live on. Many of these former slaves continued living on the same plantations where they had worked as enslaved people, as sharecroppers. They lived in the same cramped quarters, under the same oppressive conditions. The idea of owning a house or having control over one's living situation was foreign to most Black families during this period. Even when Black people found employment, whether in agriculture, domestic work, or later in industrial jobs, they had little financial freedom. Their economic situation was so unstable that they couldn't afford better housing. But even if they could, the larger societal structures were designed to keep them out of better neighborhoods. While white Americans were starting to build wealth, Black people were not allowed to do the same. They were systematically excluded from economic opportunities, and their living conditions reflected this inequality. White Americans were granted access to land, better jobs, and housing that allowed them to create lasting wealth and build communities. Meanwhile, Black families had to make do with what they could find in a system that did not want them to succeed. This division in living conditions between white and Black families set the stage for the housing inequality that would persist for generations. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, Black Americans were technically free, but freedom didn't mean equality. The end of slavery marked the beginning of a new chapter of oppression under what became known as the Jim Crow laws. These laws were a set of state and local laws that enforced racial segregation across the South, and they were designed to keep Black people separate but equal, though in reality, they ensured that Black people were anything but equal to white Americans. The Jim Crow laws didn't just affect where Black people could sit, eat, or travel. They had a direct impact on where they could live. Racial segregation was enforced in schools, public transportation, and even in the most basic aspects of daily life. When it came to housing, Black people were systematically pushed into poor, overcrowded neighborhoods, where conditions were far from equal to those of white Americans. For example, in many cities, white Americans lived in newly developed suburban areas with fresh, modern homes, clean streets, and better infrastructure. Meanwhile, Black Americans were relegated to living in older, deteriorating neighborhoods in the city's core. These neighborhoods were often overcrowded, with many people living in small homes or apartments that were poorly maintained. The city government neglected Black neighborhoods, offering them little in terms of public services, utilities, or infrastructure. This created a cycle of poverty that Black families couldn't escape, as their housing situation was directly tied to their limited access to jobs, education, and healthcare. Meanwhile, the real estate industry was another key player in maintaining segregation. Real estate agents, landlords, and developers outright refused to sell homes to Black families in white neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining. Black families were often told they couldn't live in certain areas, no matter how much money they had or how well they maintained their homes. The use of redlining was supported by banks and insurance companies, which refused to give mortgages or loans to Black families, essentially locking them out of home ownership. This practice wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. It also affected Black people in the North and West, as discrimination in housing was widespread. To make matters worse, even in neighborhoods where Black families were allowed to live, they faced constant harassment and violence from white residents. Black families who tried to move into areas with white residents often faced violent opposition, with whites engaging in tactics like arson, intimidation, and even physical assault to keep Black people out. This was particularly true in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, where tensions between Black and white residents were high. The idea that Black people didn't belong in certain neighborhoods became ingrained in American society. In many cities, entire districts were effectively off-limits to Black families, and real estate brokers, banks, and even government policies worked together to ensure this segregation remained in place. Housing discrimination became not just a matter of personal preference or prejudice. It was institutionalized and embedded in laws, policies, and the practices of various industries. The foundation of racial segregation and housing discrimination was so deep that it took decades of struggle, protests, and legal battles to even begin to chip away at its effects. Now, tired of the struggle, Black people decided to take action. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The period between 1916 and 1970 marked one of the most significant movements of Black Americans in history, the Great Migration. Over 6 million Black individuals and families left the oppressive, segregationist South in search of better opportunities in the North, Midwest, and West. They were escaping the brutal realities of sharecropping, racial violence, and the pervasive discrimination of the Jim Crow laws. They believed that life would be better in northern cities where they hoped they could find jobs, better schools, and, most importantly, a chance to live freely without the constant fear of racial violence. The promise was great, but the reality was far more complex. This migration was driven by a combination of push factors, like the oppressive conditions in the South, and pull factors, such as the industrial jobs that were booming in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. These cities were amid rapid industrialization, and factory jobs were plentiful. For Black people, it meant the possibility of earning a steady wage and improving their quality of life. But despite the prospect of better jobs and opportunities, the migration didn't bring the freedom and equality that many had hoped for. Upon arriving in northern cities, Black families were immediately confronted with another harsh reality. They were still not welcome in many neighborhoods. Housing in cities was not open or equal. While they had escaped the direct restrictions of Jim Crow laws, they found that northern cities had their systems of segregation, often enforced through informal means like neighborhood associations, private agreements, and, most notably, restrictive covenants. In response to these challenges, Black families were forced into already overcrowded neighborhoods. These were often run-down areas with limited housing stock, subpar sanitation, and insufficient public services. Cities like Harlem in New York, Southside Chicago, and Detroit's Black Bottom became symbolic of Black urban life during the early to mid-20th century. These neighborhoods were teeming with Black residents who had left the rural South in hopes of a better life, but found themselves confined to areas where the basic infrastructure and resources were stretched thin. Rent prices were high for what was available, and landlords took advantage of the shortage of decent housing. offering poorly maintained apartments that were overpriced and often dangerous. Despite these challenges, Black families in northern cities managed to build communities within these urban ghettos. They opened businesses, created cultural hubs, and supported each other through a tight-knit network of social organizations, churches, and mutual aid societies. But while these communities were places of resilience and cultural flourishing, they were also places of concentrated poverty. As the years went on, these neighborhoods faced disinvestment from both the private sector and the city government. In many cases, the government provided little to no funding for housing repairs, education, or public services in Black neighborhoods, further exacerbating the cycle of poverty. As more and more Black families arrived in northern cities, urban areas began to change. While Black communities grew in size and influence, the political and social structures in these cities remained largely controlled by white elites who weren't willing to fully integrate or share economic resources. Public services in Black neighborhoods remained inadequate, and housing conditions continued to worsen. Even though they were physically farther from the grip of Jim Crow, Black residents in northern cities faced a new, more subtle form of segregation, one that was reinforced through economic, political, and social systems that kept them from accessing the same resources and opportunities as white families. The Great Migration ultimately did not solve the housing crisis for Black Americans. It only shifted the problem to a new location. The cities promised hope, but they too had systems in place that kept Black families segregated and poor. While Black communities in northern cities were able to build vibrant cultural, political, and economic centers, they were also plagued by overcrowding, substandard housing, and racial discrimination that continued to prevent upward mobility. This migration and the urbanization of Black America set the stage for the housing struggles that would continue through the mid-20th century. Black families might have left the South, but they still found themselves fighting against the same discriminatory forces in the North. The battle for decent, affordable housing had shifted, but it was far from over. Now comes World War II. World War II created a housing crisis. The U.S. government and private companies built factories to support the war effort, and workers flooded into cities to take jobs. This resulted in a huge demand for housing. But once again, Black families faced discrimination. While white workers were able to find homes, Black workers were often forced into already crowded neighborhoods. They had to live in substandard housing while the government and private companies ignored their needs. Even when the government promised better housing options after the war, most of the benefits went to white families, leaving Black families stuck in the worst conditions. After World War II, there was a boom in suburban housing for middle-class families. The government gave low-interest loans to white families so they could buy homes in the suburbs. These areas were modern, with good schools and access to better jobs. But once again, Black Americans were left out of this opportunity. Banks and the government refused to give loans to Black families or allow them to move into suburban neighborhoods. They were restricted to inner-city areas, where poverty and crime rates were higher. This further entrenched segregation and poverty. In the mid-1900s, the U.S. government built public housing projects to provide affordable homes for low-income families. Initially, these projects were meant to help everyone, but over time, they became mostly segregated, with Black families living in many of these buildings. The government didn't invest enough in these projects, and they quickly fell into disrepair. Instead of being places where people could rise out of poverty, they became symbols of neglect and poverty. Crime rates increased, and living conditions became unbearable. These public housing projects, which were supposed to be a solution, ended up trapping Black families in poverty. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, making it illegal to discriminate against people based on race when renting or selling homes. However, even after the law was passed, Black Americans still faced many barriers. Landlords and real estate agents found other ways to discriminate, like showing Black families fewer homes or charging higher rent. Despite the legal changes, it was clear that discrimination was still deeply rooted in the housing system. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new wave of housing issues began. Black families were still facing discrimination, but now they were also dealing with the impact of poverty and job loss. The economy was changing, and many factories and industries left cities, causing high unemployment and worsening conditions in Black neighborhoods. At the same time, new policies aimed at urban renewal led to the destruction of many Black neighborhoods to make way for new developments. These neighborhoods, which were often low income but had strong community ties, were torn down with little regard for the people who lived there. As a result, many black families were displaced, and housing conditions worsened even further. So, the matter never really got fixed for the black people. While racial segregation is no longer legally enforced, it persists in the structure of modern American cities. Residential segregation, though less overt, continues to impact where black Americans can live, the quality of the housing they can afford, and the resources available in their neighborhoods. In many cities, black families are still disproportionately confined to inner-city neighborhoods, while wealthier, predominantly white families live in suburban areas with better schools, better job opportunities, and greater access to health and public services. Research shows that black Americans are still largely confined to segregated neighborhoods. According to studies by the Pew Research Center, neighborhoods in many metropolitan areas remain divided along racial lines, with black residents living in areas that tend to have fewer resources, higher poverty rates, and lower home ownership rates than predominantly white neighborhoods. Even in integrated cities, the wealth gap between black and white residents often means that black families are more likely to live in neighborhoods with limited access to quality education, healthcare, and employment opportunities. The gap in home ownership rates between black and white Americans is another stark reminder of the enduring effects of housing segregation. While about 70% of white Americans own their homes, only around 40% of black Americans are homeowners. Home ownership is a critical factor in building wealth, and the fact that black Americans have been largely excluded from this opportunity for generations has led to a massive racial wealth gap. According to a report by the Brookings Institution, the median wealth of white households in the U.S. is nearly 10 times higher than that of black households, and much of this disparity is driven by the inability of black families to accumulate wealth through home ownership. Without the ability to build equity in homes or pass down assets, black families have been stuck in a cycle of poverty and financial insecurity, while white families have been able to use home ownership as a key means of generational wealth building. Today, the U.S. is experiencing an affordable housing crisis, with millions of families struggling to find homes they can afford. For black families, the crisis is even more severe. Rising housing costs, coupled with stagnant wages and growing inequality, have made it difficult for many black Americans to secure safe, affordable housing. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports that there is a severe shortage of affordable rental units in the U.S., and the situation is even worse for black renters, who are more likely to face discrimination, higher rents, and poorer living conditions than white renters. The federal government's failure to adequately fund affordable housing initiatives has exacerbated the problem. Public housing, once seen as a solution to housing inequality, is still underfunded and plagued by neglect. Many black families continue to live in substandard housing, often in areas with limited access to resources. The lack of affordable housing has contributed to rising homelessness rates, particularly among black Americans, who are disproportionately affected by housing insecurity. So, despite all the efforts, the road to housing justice is still long. The legacy of segregation and exclusion remains, and the fight for equitable housing is far from over. But the persistence of activists, the continued focus on policy reforms, and the growing recognition of housing as a fundamental human right provide hope that meaningful change is possible. Ultimately, the story of housing in Black America is not just about brick and mortar. It's about the opportunity to build a life, a future, and a legacy. Until housing inequality is truly addressed, Black Americans will continue to face the consequences of a system that has kept them from fully participating in the American dream. The work is ongoing, and the fight for fair, affordable, and equitable housing is a crucial part of the broader struggle for racial justice. What role do you think the government should play in making housing more accessible and equitable for marginalized communities? Let us know in the comments section. How much longer do you think we can ignore the impact of historical housing discrimination before it completely fractures our society? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.